What's going on? I asked, scanning the room. Their smug expressions, brimming with satisfaction, sent a chill through me. My in-laws leaned in, savoring the moment like actors nailing a well-rehearsed performance. Finally, one of them spoke, their voice laced with barely contained glee. "We need to have a serious talk." I took a slow breath, keeping my tone even. "Go on," I said. "Edgar, my husband," exhaled heavily, his eyes refusing to meet mine. "I sold the house to my parents," he announced, letting the words settle before delivering the final blow. "And I think we should get a divorce." His parents exchanged pleased glances, their expressions triumphant, like they had won some silent war. Without hesitation, I reached into my bag, pulled out the signed divorce papers, and placed my wedding ring on the table. "Then I guess I'll be leaving," I said, my voice steady. They didn't realize the storm that was about to hit them. "My name is Madison. I just turned 50. Decades have passed since Edgar and I married, and our son is now grown, leading a life of his own. 4 years, I was an ordinary office worker, but a friend's encouragement led me down a new path. Now, I teach handmade accessory crafting, a hobby turned profession. Some might scoff at the idea, but for me, it's fulfilling. Creating something with my hands, guiding students, and watching their progress has given my life a renewed sense of purpose." Edgar and I met at work. He was with a client company, and our paths crossed often at corporate gatherings. Over time, our connection deepened, and we married for love. At least, that's what I believed. 3 years into our marriage, we were blessed with a son, a bright, energetic boy who worked hard, graduated from a prestigious university, and is now thriving in his own life. Yet, despite our son's success, Edgar and I grew more distant with each passing year. The man I once knew, a kind, considerate partner, began to change. The gentle husband I had married became demanding, treating me less like a wife and more like unpaid help. His preferences shifted unpredictably, his mood soured at the slightest inconvenience, and eventually, verbal abuse became a routine part of my days. I dreamed of leaving, of starting fresh, but the weight of an unpaid mortgage held me back. Then, Edgar quit his job without explanation. He spent his days lounging around, offering no help with the household, expecting me to keep everything afloat. Still, I stayed, not for him, but for the house. This wasn't just any house, it was my dream, built with my hard-earned savings. Every detail, from the spacious kitchen to the carefully chosen materials, was a reflection of my vision. Edgar had given his input early on, but when it came time to pay, it was my finances that made it a reality. Of course, the cost had ballooned beyond our expectations, forcing us into a much larger loan, but I didn't regret it. The joy of finally having a space I could call my own outweighed the burden. Edgar, however, sulked. "What a waste of money," he muttered often. "This was completely unnecessary." I ignored his grumbling and pressed forward, hoping the resentment would pass. It didn't. Instead, he withdrew further, his passive-aggressive antics turning into outright hostility. Then, one day, the doorbell rang. I started toward it, but Edgar, who never rushed for anything, was already on his feet. He knew who it was. Laughter and cheerful voices echoed through the entryway as the door swung open. When the living room door creaked, I found myself face to face with my in-laws, Bradley and Emerson. A familiar knot tightened in my stomach. From the very beginning, they had never accepted me. When Edgar and I announced our engagement, they barely masked their disdain, criticizing my lower social standing. Even on our wedding day, they kept their distance, their cold stares making it clear that I would never truly belong. Their interference didn't stop after marriage. They questioned everything, from how I ran my household to how I raised my son. Over the years, I learned to endure their subtle jabs and icy indifference. But today, they weren't hiding behind politeness. Without a word, they brushed past me, their shoulders knocking against mine as if I were nothing more than an obstacle in their way. Their eyes scanned the house, lingering on the kitchen with unmistakable envy. Edgar beamed as he showed them around, playing the gracious host. And when they turned back toward me, their expressions carried something sinister, an unspoken understanding. They thought they had won. But they had no idea what was coming. Satisfied for the moment, Edgar's expression suddenly darkened, his voice turned sharp and commanding. "Hurry up and prepare tea and snacks." Caught off guard, I scrambled to serve them, but his parents barely acknowledged my efforts. "Is this the best you can do?" Bradley muttered, unimpressed. They drank and ate quickly, showing more interest in the house itself than in anything I had prepared. "It's quite lovely," Bradley noted, his eyes scanning the interior. His tone was more approving of the design than appreciative of my hospitality. Then, with a broad grin, Edgar made an announcement, one that sent a chill through me. "Why don't you both move in with us?" he suggested, almost as if I weren't standing there. His parents exchanged pleased glances. They didn't give me an answer right away, but I could see it in their eyes. They were already considering it. As they left, I watched Edgar walk them to the door, chatting and laughing in a way I hadn't seen in years. The warmth he withheld from me, he freely gave to them. His invitation had opened a door I would soon regret. At first, his parents visited only a few times a month, then, a few times a week. Before long, they were showing up nearly every day, and with every visit, the criticisms never ceased. Edgar, instead of defending me, fed into it. "You never listen. You're the reason our son suffered. Everything would be easier if you just did as you were told." The weight of their constant disapproval pressed down on me, and though anger burned inside me, I found myself responding only with forced apologies, as if that might ease the tension. It didn't. Then came the worst part: his parents began showing up when I wasn't home. The evidence was everywhere: beer cans left on the table, empty bottles rolling on the floor, spills staining the new rug. The once pristine house, the home I had worked so hard to build, reeked of alcohol and carelessness. I protested. Edgar ignored me. He had stopped contributing to the household entirely, yet had no problem spending money recklessly, and soon, I discovered another issue: gambling. Crumpled betting slips appeared in his pockets, on the coffee table, even in the laundry. His losses piled up, and yet he remained indifferent. "You realize you're wasting money that I worked for?" I confronted him one evening. He just shrugged. "It's not like we're starving." But we would be, at this rate. A month into this nightmare, his parents became bolder. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected. As I stepped inside, I found them comfortably settled in my living room, as if they belonged there. My stomach twisted. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. They exchanged a smug look before Emerson spoke, her voice thick with condescension. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, dear. It's not like you're ever around." Their casual dismissal stung more than I cared to admit. Day by day, my own home felt less like mine. Edgar and his parents treated me like an outsider in the very place I had built. Frustration gnawed at me, but I refused to break. Instead, I decided, if they thought they could push me out, they were in for a surprise. Then, something strange happened. One evening, I returned home earlier than usual, only to find them already there. Normally, they came only when I was out. Narrowing my eyes, I crossed my arms. "Well, this is new. You usually wait until I'm gone." They ignored my remark and stepped inside, moving with purpose. Edgar, instead of greeting me, ushered them further in. I watched them closely as they inspected every room, the kitchen, the bathroom, even the storage spaces. Their eyes flicked from wall to floor, nodding to each other as if checking off a list. Something was off. And then, as they left, I caught the satisfied smirks on their faces. A knot of unease formed in my gut. "What was that all about?" I asked Edgar. He didn't even look at me. "None of your business." But I knew better. Something was happening, something he didn't want me to know. So I waited, I watched, and then, one day, after work, I turned onto our street, only to be met with a sight that made my blood run cold. A moving truck, parked in front of our house, bearing the logo of a company named Moving Center. And that's when I knew they were trying to erase me from my own home. As I pulled up to the house, my heart sank. A moving truck stood parked out front, its massive frame blocking part of the driveway. Edgar stood nearby, deep in conversation with the movers. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away, pretending not to see me, and disappeared into the house. But what unsettled me even more was the arrival of my in-laws at that exact moment. They greeted me casually, as if nothing was amiss, while Edgar welcomed them inside with an almost rehearsed enthusiasm. The air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Following them in, I was hit with an eerie realization: the house no longer looked like mine. The furniture I had carefully chosen, the belongings I had cherished, gone. In their place stood my in-laws' outdated, gaudy furniture, arranged as if they had lived here for years. I lowered myself onto the sofa, surrounded by their smirking faces. Their expressions dripped with satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for this moment. I knew something was coming, but I refused to let them see my unease. Finally, one of them spoke. "We need to talk," they said, barely hiding their glee. I forced a calm expression. Go on. Edgar let out a deep sigh, avoiding my gaze. I sold the house to my parents, he announced, pausing just long enough to savor my reaction before delivering the final blow. And I think we should get a divorce. His parents nodded in agreement, their smug smiles widening. They had clearly orchestrated this together, expecting me to crumble. Instead, I did something they hadn't anticipated. Without hesitation, I pulled out the signed divorce papers, slid my wedding ring onto the table, and met Edgar's stunned expression with a steady gaze. Then I guess I'll be leaving. Silence. For the first time, the smirks faltered. I had long suspected something was off. Edgar's sudden generosity toward his parents, their increasing presence in my home, the secretive glances between them, it all pointed to a plan. To confirm my suspicions, I had discreetly installed surveillance cameras around the house, syncing them to my phone. At first, I caught only their routine visits, but then, one night, I saw Edgar and his parents celebrating, toasting to the sale of the house as if it were some great victory. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just being pushed out, I was being erased. But I wasn't about to leave empty-handed. Using the information from my surveillance footage, I made sure to legally transfer the entire home loan into Edgar's name before walking away. If they wanted the house, they could take the mortgage with it. That monthly $1,900 payment? No longer my problem. I doubted Edgar or his parents had the means to cover it, and I had no intention of helping. Free from the toxicity, I settled into a beautiful new home of my own, new furniture, a fresh start, peace. One lazy afternoon, I finally allowed myself to sleep in, relishing the comfort of my new space, but just as I was about to drift back into a nap, the doorbell rang, loud and insistent. I groggily opened the door, only to be met with an unwelcome sight. Edgar and his in-laws, uninvited. I crossed my arms. What do you want? They pushed past me without answering, slamming a document down on my table. You changed the name on the home loan without telling us, Edgar accused, his voice filled with outrage. I raised an eyebrow. Of course I did. After all, you wanted me out, didn't you? For the first time, panic flickered across their faces. We can't afford the payments, Edgar's mother cried. We're all unemployed. Edgar clenched his fists. That loan is too much for us. I shrugged, my tone indifferent. Not my problem. If you don't pay, the interest will keep adding up, and the bank won't care about your excuses. Edgar scoffed, as if I were bluffing, but as I watched him frantically pull out his phone and search for information, his expression changed. Shock, panic, desperation. What are we going to do? His mother muttered, her voice trembling. I feigned sympathy. Well, you could get a job. It's time for a fresh start. Their faces paled even further. They had no savings. Edgar had no stable income. And thanks to his gambling, he was drowning in debt. I could almost see the walls closing in around them. Please, Edgar finally said, his voice softer now, trying for sincerity, we've been through so much together. I tilted my head, and yet, you tried to steal everything from me. With that, I shut the door in their faces. Out of desperation, Edgar and his parents attempted one final move. They reported me to the police. It was laughable. With no legal grounds to stand on, they were promptly dismissed. Eventually, unable to keep up with the mortgage, they lost the house. Forced to relocate, they ended up in a small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. Edgar took a part-time job, barely scraping by. And me? My life flourished. I continued my work, but in my spare time, I started a blog about my handmade crafts. To my surprise, it gained traction. Soon, I was doubling my monthly income, getting requests for workshops and classes. Remarriage never crossed my mind. I had everything I needed. One evening, as I tidied up, I stumbled upon an old household account book from my early days of marriage. The memories of financial struggles, of fighting to make ends meet, flickered through my mind. But unlike back then, there was no sadness now. With quiet resolve, I placed the book back on the shelf and smiled. I had built my happiness on my own. And this time, no one could take it from me.